Hi everyone, I want to make a quick little video and go over some of the topics and an example of some of the psychological disorders that are given in your last chapter. Now this is chapter 15, so this is technically your last chapter. So I want to go over a little bit about mental disorders in general. When we look at mental disorder, we look at mental illness. Back in 1953, American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Association, and several other organizations came together and said there needs to be a consensus. There needs to be some type of platform where everyone is on the same page. And so in 1953, in that area, they developed what's called the DSM, and that is the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. If you look in your chapter, you will see that it now states the DSM-5, and that was actually published in July 31st, 2013. So it's been out for a couple of years now. And let me kind of tell you how this works. When they look to develop a consensus, it was about looking at criteria for diagnosing someone with a disorder, but not only the criteria for diagnosing, but also what are the symptoms? What are the symptoms that we're going to use to diagnose this patient? So within the DSM, you have criteria that someone needs to meet in order to say we think this person might be suffering from depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. But there will also be a list of the symptomology. So when it says, a symptoms may have nine symptoms, but they have to have so many in order to meet that criteria. So when you look at the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which everyone goes by, and looking at the disorders, it gives criteria and it gives symptomology. The one thing it does not do is tell us what causes someone's mental disorder or mental disturbance. That is something that we have to do as clinicians, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists. We do what's called intakes, assessments. We're constantly assessing. So we have to sit down to see whether or not that patient makes that criteria. It is objective. Someone doesn't say, these are my personal opinions about depression and this is what I'm going to say symptoms are. We go by that DSM. So you look at the criteria, you look at symptoms, it's very objective. And it promotes a lot of things. First of all, it gets everybody on the same page. If I was looking at someone's chart that was in California and they came to Florida, I could get their chart and go, okay, I know what that was, that what they were diagnosed. And so I have, an idea about where I need to go from there. So that helps us. Causation. Causation is a total different ballgame. That's where you have to go in and make those assessments, maybe take some inventories, talk with that individual, because you're looking at three areas. You're looking at biological. There are heritability in some disorders, and we know that based on research. So we know that heredity factors play into some disorders. We call it diathesis stress model. Some people are more vulnerable to some disorders than others. So we have those percentages. And so if I was asking someone, is there any depression in your family? Is there addiction in your family? I can kind of get an idea, based on that information, because we know for sure there's some biological traits. What is the traits? What is the heritability of that specific disorder? Some are not, some are less. So you look from a biological model, you look at a psychological model. What are the social contexts that you were in? You look at parenting, you look at childhood, you look at development. All of that together from a psychological standpoint will help us to put a picture of that person's background. And then cultural, you look at social cultural. We live in an individualistic country. So when you look at different cultures and how those individuals were raised and how that culture influences, we kind of take a biopsychocultural perspective. It's a model. It's a psychobio social cultural model that we use to put a picture together and do an assessment. And that assessment, of course, is always ongoing. We're constantly interviewing, constantly reassessing a patient. So you have the DSM that gives you criteria, it gives you symptoms from an objective standpoint based on research. And then you also look at the model of causation. And so within your chapter, the beginning of your chapter, they're talking a little bit about that. So it kind of gives you an idea about how we go about it. Then we look at how disorders kind of group together. So if you look inside the DSM, you would see mood disorders and mood disorder categories, and that's going to be your major depression. That's going to be bipolar 1, bipolar 2, dysthymia, all those. If you look at anxiety chapter, you would see, or an anxiety section of the DSM, you're going to see generalized anxiety disorder. You're going to see panic disorder, and you're going to see phobic disorder and social anxiety. You're going to see another area with OCD, hoarding within, in 2013. So you're going to see a little bit of what the criteria and symptomology looks like within each of those groupings in the DSM. There's even a section in the beginning that's infant, childhood, adolescent. Why? Because it starts in infant, child, adolescent. So just giving an example of mood disorders. When you look at mood disorders, we have 3 moods that we acknowledge. We have depression, mania, and mixed. But let me tell you how it gets to that point. If you take a scale and you have 1 being the North Pole and 10 being the South Pole, you're going to look at opposite poles. And so say, for instance, I go down to 1, and I'm going to name this the North Pole, and I'm going to name this the South Pole. And I go to the North Pole, and I get a call that says, we think Santa is, something's wrong with Santa. I get a call from the elves, and I go and I start talking to Santa. I'm going to start looking to see whether or not he has a mood based on the one side, and I'm going to look at severity, and I'm going to look at duration. Now, if you look in your chapter, you will see, it gives an example of some of the symptoms that we look for. So say, for instance, I start talking to Santa, and he says, yeah, I don't feel right, I'm not sleeping, I'm not eating, I'm having difficulty concentrating, I'm having a lot of guilt, I'm sad more days than not. I'm going to be checking, because I know that the criteria here in the North Pole, the criteria is 9 symptoms for depression. And when you look at the 9 symptoms of depression, I'm going to see whether or not he has 5 or more of those 9 symptoms. Symptoms, that's what's listed in the DSM. The criteria for an episode is 5 or more for a period of 2 weeks. Now, we know based on research that most people go many, many months having depression, but I need to see it, or someone needs to tell me by self-report or by others that he has been displaying 5 or more of these symptoms for a period of 2 weeks. Now, let's look at depression. When you think about depression, depression is a mood, but where does it come from? Where does it originate from? Well, we look at one of our primary emotions. If you remember the emotion chapter, we have 5 primary emotions. You take sadness, you take happiness, you take fear, disgust, anger. And so you take sadness. We all are sad. We get sad about things. We can go from one emotion to the next. We can have several emotions at one time. But if you prolong that emotion, duration, and you make it severe to the point where, I hate to use a snap out of it type of cliche, then it becomes a mood. A mood is a state of being. You can't just all of a sudden, say, oh, I'm not going to be sad anymore. Mood is a state of being. It's not so difficult to, as we would say, kind of get out of it, so to speak, snap out of it, so to speak. And so I'm going to look for that. So the criteria in the DSM specifically says, by self-report or report from others feeling sad more days than not, for a period of 2 weeks, 5 or more of the following, and it lists the symptoms. And if I see that with Santa, then I can state that maybe he's having an episode of major depression. Okay, let's go to the other pole. The other pole I said was the South Pole. And so I go down, I get a phone call, and all of a sudden somebody's really frantic, and they say, hey, penguins are going crazy down here in Antarctica. And they are super, super happy. They're flipping out. They're jumping up icebergs. They can't calm down. They're happy, 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 happy. So I go down there, I see this happy. Happy is a primary emotion. We can be happy. But it gets to the point where you can't control your happiness, and you're so happy, you are so high, you're high on yourself that you can't calm down. You're like happy, 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 happy. And it's becoming more severe, and it's prolonged, the duration is increased. It's no longer just an emotion, it becomes a mood. And the mood is mania. So when you hear back in the 60s and 70s where it's called manic depression, that is exactly manic depression. We call this now bipolar. North Pole, South Pole, opposite ends. So it's bipolar. Now, just to give an example, because I gave Santa a major depressive episode, as an example. So I come down here to the penguins, and again, criteria, symptoms, and it's objective. It states it in the DSM. The criteria, 1 week, not 2. Symptoms, 7. Criteria, 3 or more of the following for a period of 1 week. I'm going to look at all of those symptoms. I could probably observe it and see that the penguins probably need some help. And a full-blown 10, remember 110, full-blown 10, you're out of control. We're basically in a full-blown manic episode. You hear about that situation where people are running down the street, I don't know, naked, screaming, I'm going to say the penguins. Okay, that's a full-blown. If you're out of control, and we look at some of the symptoms of you haven't slept, you don't need to eat, you are spending a lot of money, you're doing dangerous behaviors, you're out of control, then that might, based on the criteria, say that you're in a manic episode. If that is a full-blown manic episode, a 10, that is the diagnosis that we give a bipolar 1. Bipolar 1 is a full-blown 10. In order to diagnose bipolar, it is necessary to see that manic episode. I'm not worried about the North Pole. You probably have already been there. You're probably going to go there. But in order to diagnose bipolar, we must see a manic episode. That is necessary by diagnosis. So you look at, I gave Santa a major depressive diagnosis. Now I'm giving the penguins, because they are just flipping out, a manic episode. And so therefore, because I saw that manic, bipolar 1. Now, look at the scale. Here's the scale. Okay, so not everyone reaches a full-blown 10 manic episode. Some people maybe get to Alaska. And when you think about Alaska, maybe Alaska's dark 3 or 4 months of the year, or it's light 3 or 4 months of the year. So not everybody gets to 1 or a 10. But if people are what we call 7 or an 8, not a full-blown 10, we call that a hypomanic episode. And in a hypomanic episode, it's a mild manic episode. If I see same criteria, but I see it's not a full-blown manic, maybe you still have faculties about yourself. You can still stop and go, okay, I'm really, really happy and I'm really high on myself, but you're still doing dangerous behaviors and lack of sleep and everything else. That criteria, hypomanic, probably been depressed, but I'm going to give a bipolar 2. And so bipolar 2 diagnosis is what we see mainly here in the United States. So as you can see, when you look at criteria, this is specific. This is a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of organizations behind this. It promotes this, or promotes the research. This is why we do it. That you really have to know basically what are the symptoms and the criteria for diagnosing depression, what is the criteria for diagnosing a bipolar disorder. Because I've had people come up to me and say, oh, I've been diagnosed bipolar, and I would say, what was that level of manic? Oh, I've never been manic. Well, guess what? That has to be there in order to diagnose bipolar disorder. It's a necessary criteria. We're not worried about the other side. So that kind of just gives you an idea about all of the research in the field of clinical and abnormal psychology, and how much work. I mean, this is you will see in your chapter the DSM-5, and so that's a lot of work since the 1950s to 2013 when the last edition came out, and all of those changes. You give an example like PTSD. PTSD was an actual disorder to where we had the criterion diagnosis to like 1980. Now look how long we know it's probably been around, but as a full diagnosis. So there were a lot of changes in the DSM and the DSM-5. I know some of you have heard of Asperger's. We see and hear a lot about autism. That disorder's out. We call it autism spectrum disorder. So we have added a few new ones, and we have taken and modified others. We do this. This is part of our research, part of our job. So look in your chapter, look at the criteria, look at we name it. I think there's a section in your chapter where it has all of the disorders, and then we have personality disorders. And I think towards your end, in your chapter, it does talk a little bit about personality disorders when you look at borderline personality and antisocial. Now, we call it antisocial personality disorder. Most people will say sociopathic disorder. We identify 10 personality disorders, but I think they only give you a couple of examples in the chapter. In my abnormal psych class, we go over everything, all the disorders, all the symptoms. But your chapter, and again, this is general psychology, kind of gives you an idea about how intense the research is in this actual field, and how much of the studies and grants and fundings go into treatment, to causation, to understanding it more and more. And every year we understand more and more about it. But remember the causation: biological, psychological, social, cultural. The DSM does not tell me what caused it, and it only gives me the criteria and the symptoms. So when you read through your chapter, I think it's a great chapter. It was written well. It gives you an idea and just some samples of all the different disorders. There's a section that talks about dissociative disorders, and we call it dissociative identity disorder. You hear it as multiple personality disorder. We don't call it that anymore, but it kind of gives you an idea about all the different areas within the DSM and how we actually go about and actually how we diagnose. So take a look at that this week. And don't forget the last quiz. Check the chapters, and then of course the end of course exam. So I hope that kind of helps you out with how we actually look at diagnosing. And bipolar is very popular, so that's usually what I talk about in class, but that kind of gives you an idea. But there are some examples of some other disorders in your chapter, so take a look at that, read it. If you have any questions, just let me know. Again, you can call me, text me, or send me an email. And just think about trying to wrap things up, because December 9th is going to be here before you know it. I think we have like another week. So just make sure you kind of look into those Learn Smart modules as well. So hope that clarified it for you, and hope you enjoyed this chapter. Bye.